Is James Pearce Jr. a potential wild card for the Falcons in round one?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And guys, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. AKA. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 20 years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as an everydayer. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an illustrious everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So on today's Locked On Falcons, we're going to talk about, is the Falcons' hardline stance on Kirk Cousins costing them? You know, the talk of trading back in round one seems a little bit more plausible given the player that we're going to spend the bulk of today's podcast talking about, which is a player that we haven't really spent much time talking about as a potential round one option, basically over the last 6+ weeks, and that is Tennessee edge rusher James Pearce Jr. And I'm reminded of a comment from King Falcon Gaming about 11 days ago when we did our edge rusher showdown breakdown, where we kind of broke down the four edges that we thought were most likely to be options for the Falcons in round one into two broad categories of speed versus power rushers: Donovan Ezaraco of Boston College and Mike Green of Marshall in the speed rush category, and Shamar Stewart of Texas A&M and Michael Williams of Georgia in the power rush category. And King Falcon Gaming basically asked, why didn't I talk about James Pearce and Jalen Walker in that episode? And my response to his comment, I'll read it verbatim: you can lump Pearce into the Green Ezaraco group, but the main reason I didn't talk about him because I don't expect Pearce to be in consideration at 15. Walker is a little harder to talk about because he spent the majority of his time playing off-ball linebacker, so it's hard to parse his production just as an edge rusher. He kind of exists as his own thing, not to mention the general consensus is that he'll be gone by the Falcons pick. So, maybe we'll talk about Jalen Walker a little bit more in depth later this week if, talking about the possibility of him falling in the draft. But let's focus on James Pearce Jr., particularly in lieu of Jonathan Jones of CBS Sports mocking him to the Falcons at pick 15 in his one and only mock draft that he does each and every year. And the reason why this is significant, later in the episode, we'll talk about why we don't spend that much time thinking about mock drafts on this podcast, but we try to pay attention to select mock drafts, is because Jonathan Jones's track record when it comes to the Falcons pick is pretty good, right? He did successfully project 3 out of the last 4 first-round picks for the Falcons. Kyle Pitts, Kyle Hamilton, that was wrong, Bijan Robinson, and most importantly, Michael Penix Jr. He had the Michael Penix Jr. pick, I believe, a week before last year's draft, around that time when Jonathan Jones, Adam Schefter, Jeremy Fowler, a handful of various insiders started saying, hey, keep an eye on Penix for the Falcons at 8. And at the time, for those of you that were everydayers last year, we dismissed it. We did a whole episode the day before the draft saying, no chance, no team in the history of sports has ever making Michael Penix. And of course, the Falcons, as I discussed on yesterday's episode, have a tendency to get a little weird. But let's talk a little bit more about James Pearce. And it's not just Jonathan Jones that's talking about potentially James Pearce to the Falcons at 15. Albert Breer of Sports Illustrated also mentioned James Pearce Jr. when he did his entire needs breakdown for the all 32 teams picking in round one. And he wrote, 2 names I've heard more consistently linked to Atlanta in this spot are Marshall's Mike Green and Tennessee's James Pearce Jr. Both have character flags that the Falcons have to weigh. So let's talk about James Pearce Jr. and let's take it from the stance of why it makes sense for the Falcons to like a player like James Pearce Jr., piggybacking on some of the things that we've talked about in previous episodes of this podcast and what the Falcons value, right? 2 main reasons: production and pedigree with James Pearce Jr., right? We talked before, I think that was last week, where we looked at 5 different categories of PFF metrics: sacks, win rate, pass rush productivity, their win rate and pass rush productivity, and true pass sets as well. and sort of talking about which pass rushers the Falcons historically under Terry Fontenot have been attracted to. And they've primarily been attracted to productive pass rushers in college, like Laiatu Latu, Braylon Trice, Arnold Ebiketie, and whatnot. And we talked about how Ezeraku and Mike Green were very productive in college that fit that billing. But James Pearce actually was more productive in college than both of those guys, looking at those 5 metrics and where he sort of ranked among this draft class, as well as if you go back to 2023, he was even more productive in that season, basically being like 99th percentile in those productivity metrics that we're looking at with PFF, edging out guys like Ezeraku and Green that are in the 90s, but not quite, elite of the elite. And then you couple that production with the fact that James Pearce Jr. played in the SEC, doing it at a higher level against a higher level of competition. And one of the other tendencies that we should talk about with the Falcons, and one reason why a guy like Mike Green may not be as high on their board as we often have been making that assumption for the last couple of weeks as sort of the apple of their eye, is because Mike Green went to a small school in Marshall, played in the Sun Belt. Right. And the Falcons under Terry Fontenot have tended to gravitate towards more Power 5 big school guys early in the draft. Now, when we talk about Power 5, we're talking SEC, Pac-12, Big 10, Big 12, ACC, and Notre Dame. Right. And so when you look at Terry Fontenot's 4 drafts, 77% of all their draft picks have been Power 5 guys. Now, the NFL average over that period of time is about 80%. So the Falcons have basically had one less Power 5 guy than the average NFL team over that 4-year period of time. But what's notable to me is the last 2 drafts, especially the Falcons, have not drafted a single player that did not come from a Power 5 school, again, counting Notre Dame and J.D. Bertrand as a Power 5 school. And the NFL average over the last 2 years has been about 16% of your draft picks would be non-Power 5 guys. So the Falcons, based off of the 14 picks they've had, should have drafted at least 2 non-Power 5 guys, and they drafted none in the last 2 years. So does that, could that be just a simple coincidence? Probably. Most of these things are coincidental. But given that the Falcons' hit rate on non-Power 5 guys in those first 2 drafts in 21 and 22 was not particularly good, particularly in the early rounds, Richie Grant, Darren Hall in the 2nd and 4th round in 21, Troy Anderson, Desmond Ridder, and D'Angelo Malone in the 2nd and 3rd rounds of 22. Now, you could say they arguably hit on the Power 5, non-Power 5 guys with Avery Williams in round 5 and 21 and Tyler Algier in round 5 out of BYU in 2022. But it does feel like if we're assuming that this is not just merely a quirk or coincidence with the Falcons avoiding Power 5 guys the last couple of drafts, that they're basically saying, like, we're going to bet on guys that played against premium elite competition. Now, this is not a stance that is unique to the Terry Fontenot regime. This was something that Thomas Dimitroff was very vocal throughout his time as the previous GM here in Atlanta, that the Falcons rarely used 1st and 2nd round picks on non-Power 5 guys throughout the 14 years that Thomas Dimitroff ran the Falcons draft. There was one exception, and that was Robert Alford, who they drafted in the 2nd round in the 2013 draft. And what's notable about that exception is Robert Alford showed, coming from southeastern Louisiana, showed that he could handle his own against quality competition because he played in the Senior Bowl. And when you look at some of the non-Power 5 guys that the Falcons drafted under Dimitroff in the 3rd and 4th rounds, a lot of those guys went to all-star games, right? Shrine Bowl, Texas versus the Nation, I think, with Chris Owens. Harry Douglas was at the Senior Bowl as well. And we know that this current regime does value all-star games, that the vast majority of their non-underclass picks are all-star game participants over the last 4 years. And so that could kind of equal things out. As we know, Mike Green went to the Senior Bowl, had a good week of practice there. Again, I don't think he was the best edge rusher there at the Senior Bowl, but certainly had the one big highlight of the Senior Bowl that everybody's going to remember from that Senior Bowl. But, that may help equalize the Falcons, feel a little bit better about a quote-unquote small school guy from Mike Green because of what he did at the Senior Bowl. So maybe they won't put as much pedigree on James Pearce Jr., but the main reason, going back to King Falcon Gaming's and sort of my statement of we don't consider James Pearce to be in consideration, is because of the maturity concerns with James Pearce Jr., right? Despite his productivity, despite his pedigree, there's been a lot of talk about coachability, him being checked out this past season at Tennessee. And we can go to Bruce Feldman, who writes for The Athletic, and in his Intel article that he wrote about some of the players in this draft class, talking to various NFL coaches, And one coach, D-line coach, was said to, that kid is a first-round talent, but the stuff you hear about his maturity scares me. Another D-line coach says, we don't even talk about him. How coachable is he? And then there was a linebacker coach what said he was good in the interview. He knows football and is plenty smart. He's got all the talent. So if the Falcons are going to go in the James Pearce Jr. direction, maybe that linebackers coach is Barrett Ruud or somebody like that. But, they seem to feel good about James Pearce Jr. and where he's at, unlike seemingly the majority. And Bruce Feldman also did a mock draft earlier this offseason where he talked to the various college coaches that played against the players that he was mocking. And with James Pearce Jr., I think he had going like 27 or 29 in the draft. A college offensive lineman that coached against him said, we felt like we could neutralize him with some chips and take him out. He wants no part of setting the edge and stopping the run. He reminds me a lot of former Falcons first rounder Vic Beasley. So some red flags with James Pearce Jr., red flags that for me up to this point has caused me to not really put him much in consideration for the Falcons at 15. But given, Albert Breer saying it, Jonathan Joe saying it, and the fresh memories of coming on a podcast 24 hours before the draft and saying there's no chance that the Falcons are going to take Michael Penix, and then them taking Michael Penix, I am doing my best this year to learn from my mistakes, guys, and to open the door to all infinite possibilities for the Falcons, particularly when it comes to taking a pass rusher in round one. I'm a little less willing to open those doors for alternative options, but it does feel like a lot of people think the Falcons are going to go pass rusher in round one. Adam Schefter talked about that in an article, but more on that later. But, the last little tidbit I'll say about James Jones is I was talking with the Locked On Falcons insiders, link in the description below if you want to become one. And I was basically giving my ceiling comps for, the top 5 or so edges. And I was struggling with Donovan Ezeraku, and I ultimately kind of settled on a less explosive Nick Benito with those guys. If you want to hear the rest of them, by all means, become a Locked On Falcons insider at the link in the description below. 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month after that point. But one person asked me specifically about Ezeraku, what about Brian Burns as a comp for Ezeraku? And I was like, I don't quite see it with Brian Burns and Ezeraku. If I was going to make a Brian Burns ceiling comp for a player in this draft class, it would be James Pearce Jr. Now, I don't think James Pearce Jr. and Brian Burns are at the same level as prospects, but I do think if James Pearce Jr. reaches his ceiling in the NFL, he could be a Brian Burns-esque pass rusher. He could be that Batman total pass rusher, that borderline top 15 edge that I think Brian Burns is probably somewhere in that 12 to 15 range as far as edge rushers go in the NFL from a productivity standpoint. And, that's obviously something that the Falcons lack. And so I don't think anybody would be complaining about that. I think one of the things watching the film the last 2 years with James Pearce Jr., and if he is the pick, I will look forward to doing an even deeper dive on his film, just because I haven't spent as much time thinking about James Pearce Jr., again, for the reasons I mentioned, sort of being a little too dismissive early in this process on him. But one of the things that I did notice watching the film is that he did feel like he got better in terms of adding a power element to his game this past year than he had in previous years. And so I think that's going to be a big determining factor to his long-term success in the NFL, as we've discussed, going back to that edge rusher showdown. When we talk about power translates to the next level. Speed doesn't always necessarily translate unless you have like elite speed. And I think James Pearce Jr. has good speed, but maybe not elite speed. He's, his speed is enhanced because he's really good at timing the snap, which is less reminiscent of Vic Beasley from 2015, but Shane Ray from 2015. But again, we will talk more about James Pearce Jr. if need be in the future, should he be the Falcons pick. But, that being said, if James Pearce Jr. is the guy, wouldn't it be smart if the Falcons could move back and still land him in this draft? And that allows us to talk a little bit more about the Falcons' potential trade back opportunities in this year's draft. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So we know there's nothing like the energy of a live NBA playoff game, but unfortunately, Davion Mitchell ruined that for us Atlanta Hawks fans. And so instead, we're invested in the energy of a nice, afternoon in Atlanta at Truist Park to watch the Atlanta Braves this spring and this summer. And the beautiful thing about our sponsor, Game Time, is if you're sitting there and you're like, it's a nice day, I could go down to the ballpark, get a hot dog and a beer. But I don't know about last minute plans and being spontaneous. Well, you don't have to worry about that with Game Time because they're great at getting you those last minute tickets and making it even easier to get them, because prices on Game Time's app actually drop as the event gets closer. And with their all-in pricing that you can toggle on in the app, you will actually see the total cost upfront and no surprise fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So if we're having the conversation of what if James Pearce Jr. is their guy, wouldn't it be smart, given the expectation that a lot of people haven't really thought about James Pearce Jr. as a top 15 pick, that the Falcons could potentially move back and get him, right? The general perception is that the NFL is much lower on James Pearce than seemingly, allegedly, whatever you want to say, the Falcons could be, right? And we've talked about this on the podcast, my skepticism, my concerns about the Falcons' ability to move back because you have a bunch of edge-needy teams picking immediately after him: 16 Arizona, 17 Cincinnati, 19 Tampa Bay. And if you move back, you may not be able to get the same guy that you could have gotten at 15, because that one of those three teams could take him if you move back to 20 or later or whatever. And I think it's notable, again, going back to Albert Breer's article about the team needs, he mentions Michael Williams to the Arizona Cardinals specifically as a high character guy that the Cardinals have been attracted to these last couple of years. He mentions Donovan Ezeraku, 19 to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This is not the first time. I've seen a lot of Bucs people that I know that are plugged into the Bucs talk about Ezeraku for the Falcons at 19. And that's part of the reason why I think Ezeraku is in play for the Falcons at 15, similar to, one of the few times I have actually accurately projected the Falcons pick back in the 2020 draft with AJ Terrell. Like a week before the draft, I heard from somebody that the Raiders like AJ Terrell at 19. And I'm like, well, if the Raiders like AJ Terrell at 19, I better check out this guy and see if the Falcons like him at 16. And then, at that point, for those of you that don't know the story, I had, like so many people, watched the national title game, watched him get cooked by Jamar Chase, and like, oh, that guy stinks, and just basically ignored AJ Terrell for many weeks, for many months. And then a week before the draft, I was like, I think he's going to be the pick. But that is that situation. So that's why, to me, the Ezeraku thing, you constantly hear me mentioning it. Again, we're just throwing stuff at the wall, guys. But I've done these mock draft database over the since basically the beginning of March, and looked at 166 different mock drafts in that period of time. And I've specifically tracked the 6 edges that aren't Abdul Carter that are consistently projected to go in round 1: Jalen Walker, Michael Williams, Mike Green, Shamar Stewart, Donovan Ezeraku, and James Pearce Jr., and where they get picked in these mock drafts. And when you look at their average draft position in those 166 mocks that I've looked at, Jalen Walker's kind of in a tier by himself because he consistently mocks to the Panthers at 8. Then you have Williams, Green, and Stewart in that middle first round tier, where sometimes they're top 10 picks, sometimes they're picked in the late 20s, but it averages out to be around 15, 16, 17 range for their average draft position. And then Ezeraku and Pearce, their average ADP is roughly like 25, 26 in that range, consistently mocked after pick 25. And what's notable about James Pearce in that regard is, of this 6-man group, he is the one that consistently falls out of the first round in the various mock drafts that I've looked at. That of the 166 mocks I've looked at, he's only in about 63% of them in round 1. Ezeraku's in about 70%, Mike Green's 90, Stewart is 96, Williams is 97, and Walker is 98% of them. And you go to websites like NFL Mock Draft Database.com, and I think the sort of quote unquote consensus pick for James Pearce Jr. is pick 27 in Baltimore. And in about 60% of the mocks I've looked at that James Pearce actually appears in, not counting the ones where he falls out of the first round, he goes to either Baltimore at 27, Detroit at 28, Washington at 29, or Philadelphia at 32. And so it's basically the idea. And again, we try not to base too much of our opinions on Locked On Falcons on mock drafts, but they are noteworthy data points. They're useful data points. But it's the idea that if the mock drafts have the general vibe on how the majority of the NFL feels about James Pearce Jr., if you're going to trade back, if you're the Atlanta Falcons, right, you have better odds of being able to move back 3, 4, 5 potentially 10 spots, a team like Houston picking at 25 coming up for a left tackle, and still being able to get James Pearce Jr. at pick, 20 to 25 than you would be if Mike Green or Michael Williams or Shamar Stewart or even Donovan Ezeraku at that point in time. And so if you do covet Pearce like that and you do see him above the rest of that group, obviously the obvious thing is you just pick them and be done with it. But if you feel like you can kind of finesse the board a little bit and you're like, we feel just as good about James Pearce as we do any of those other guys, then, moving back makes a little bit more sense. So I do feel like if that is the case, the scenario where James Pearce Jr. is very high on the Falcons board, and as we've discussed, there are reasons to believe that is possibility, it makes a trade back more plausible to me than it would be if they were trying to get an Ezeraku, if they were trying to get a Stewart or a Green or a Williams or whatever. So we will see. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Adam Schefter's draft intel had the Falcons. He basically said his intel tells him that the Falcons are either going to take a pass rusher or trade back. And, like Jonathan Jones, Schefter was early on the Penix bandwagon. And by early, I mean like 7 days before the draft happened. And so hopefully that gives us reassurance. We're going to trust all the people that told us about Penix is basically what I'm saying. So what Jonathan Jones says, what Jeremy Fowler says, and what Adam Schefter says, we're going to put a little bit more stock in what those guys say because they were early on the Penix stuff, relatively speaking. And so basically Adam Schefter saying that pass rusher or trade back makes me feel a little bit better, as we discussed on yesterday. The Falcons aren't going to do anything weird, but we'll see on that front. But that's not the main thing that we got from Adam Schefter's draft intel article, because since we didn't get our Kirk Cousins update over the weekend, we got one today in that piece, and we got a little bit more insight into why a Kirk trade looks a lot less likely unless the Falcons are going to be a little less willing to play hardball on Kirk's money. And we'll get into all of that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, did you know that your Fire TV is also an Xbox? You can turn any TV into a gaming and entertainment hub with Fire TV Stick 4K devices. No console required. Just grab your paired controller, subscribe, or sign into an Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with EA Play included, and you're ready to play. Dive into hundreds of premium titles from EA Sports College Football 25 to Call of Duty Black Ops 6 as easily as you stream your favorite shows. It's gaming made simple, and it's all on your Fire TV. And don't forget the endless 4K streaming, where you can watch more than 1.5 million movies and TV episodes from your favorite subscribe services like Netflix, Prime Video, Disney Plus, Max, and more. So whether you're a hardcore or casual gamer, or you have no interest in video games at all, Fire TV has got you covered. Head to Amazon.com/Fire TV Locked On to get started. Xbox Game Pass Ultimate subscription and compatible controller required. Available on select devices, including Fire TV Stick 4K 2nd Gen, Fire TV Stick 4K Max 1st and 2nd Gen, and Fire TV Cube 3rd Gen. So we spent some time talking about this on Locked On Sports Atlanta, on the Atlanta Football Party, with myself, Jarvis Davis, Tanisha Batiste, and Tori McElhaney. First 20 minutes of this podcast was us talking about that. So if you want more insight, and not just my insight, go check out Locked On Sports Atlanta Football Party on Monday, April 21st, to get more thoughts on it, differing perspectives on the whole thing. But Adam Schefter reported in his intel article that the Falcons have asked acquiring teams that call about Kirk Cousins to pay 20 of the remaining $45 million in guaranteed money. Now, as far as I know, it's actually $37.5 million guaranteed rather than 45. Maybe Schefter is just taking the 90 million guaranteed and splitting it in half. But according to Schefter, to date, no team has been willing to do that, and no team is expected to be willing to. And then he adds that this weekend's draft could shift things, mentions the Vikings and Steelers specifically as teams that might be willing to pay $10 million instead of $20 million, and also talks about the sliding scale, where the more money that the Falcons are willing to eat, right, the higher the draft pick they'll be able to get. If the Falcons continue to, they'll be less likely to get a higher draft pick if they continue their hardline stance. And so this piggybacks on a point we made last week when talking about Albert Breer talking about this in lieu of the Joe Flacco signing in Cleveland, that he basically said Cleveland pivoted off Cousins to Flacco because it was going to cost them less, and they figured they'd get similar value on the football field for cheaper. And the worry for the Falcons right now, for in a world where we're trying to trade Kirk Cousins, which is hopefully the world we're in, but as we'll discuss to wrap up today's episode, I don't know if the Falcons are really operating in that world. the worry is that other teams are going to pivot off of Kirk too because of this hardline stance of needing to eat $20 million. And again, is that $10 million this year and then the $10 million roster bonus next year? Again, all that is unknown at this point in time. But as I've said from the jump, since December, January, I don't think there's going to be much interest in Kirk Cousins unless he's cheap, right? And we've talked about this before, this being a copycat league. And, I don't think anybody's going to be paying a premium for a 36, soon to be 37-year-old quarterback at this point in time. The Falcons were essentially the last team to do that. And any team that's going to want Kirk Cousins is going to want to do it for a bargain. And so for me, this hardline stance that the Falcons are making, I don't quite understand. My stance, it's been clear for months now that the Falcons should be bending over backwards to try to move on from Kirk Cousins. And if that means eating the majority of that $27.5 million in base salary this year so that you can you increase the odds of getting a 4th or 5th round pick, then so be it. And if if all someone's offering you is a conditional 7th round pick for that, then so be it, take it, Now I've seen others, tend to defend the Falcons when it comes to this hardline stance. I don't quite understand that. Obviously I have a bias on this, but for me, I've just kind of figured that the whole point was for the Falcons to kind of take their medicine, which is the dead money on Kirk Cousins this year, potentially trading him and taking $37.5 million in dead money or more if they eat more of that salary, so that it can be free of the Kirk Cousins contract in 2026. Similar to how we go back to 2022 when the Falcons traded Matt Ryan, had to take at that time, which was the biggest dead money hit in NFL history. And that allowed them to free up the money that they were able to spend to improve the roster in 2023. And the Falcons approach this offseason, that sort of low key, we're trying to tread water approach that, at least I see it as, and I'm sure the Falcons see it as, like, no, we've gotten significantly better. And I think most people on the planet are like, you sure about that? But to me, that low key approach was based around that idea of we're going to take our medicine this year and then we'll be free of this next year. And if you can't deal Kirk as soon as possible, that doesn't become a possibility, right? Because the goal is to try to deal Kirk before June 1st, because if you can trade him before June 1st, you'll take all the dead money this year, but you'll be free of it. You'll have $0 Kirk Cousins attached to Kirk Cousins' name on your team in 2026, which I think should be beneficial for obvious reasons, right? To get better at the team so that we don't sit here a year from now being like, well, we don't have the cap space to actually improve the roster, as seems to be the overwhelming narrative this year, right? And then even if you can get a trade going after June 1st, right, it does clear more cap space this year, but you still got to carry about $25 million in dead money next year, right? And if you're continuing to play hardball to the point that you can't even trade him after June 1st, and the trade deadline comes and goes in November and Kirk is still here, then you have to cut him next year, right? Because, they ain't keeping him at $60 million. $40 million backup, you want a $60 million backup? Good luck with that. But, if you cut him, depending on whether you do a pre or post June 1 cut, right? If it's a pre June 1 cut, you're potentially eating up to $35 million in dead money, depending on the offsets for that $10 million bonus. It's 25 plus whatever doesn't get offset should Kirk sign with another team. And then if you do a post June 1 cut of him next offseason, right, then you're splitting that $35 million, presumably 22.5 and 26 minus whatever offsets, and then 12.5 and 27. So this hardline stance, to me, you're just pushing more of Kirk's money and dead money into future years. And I just don't get it. Now, when I say I don't get it, guys, you'll hear me say that I don't get this. It's not because I don't get it. Like, I understand why the Falcons are doing what they're doing. I just think it's dumb. That's basically when I say I don't get it. It's like, I get it, but it's dumb, right? Why are you being dumb? I don't get why you're being so dumb. That's basically how I sort of feel about it. And it's like, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier this offseason when the Falcons decided not to cut Kirk Cousins ahead of that $10 million bonus trigger in 2026, that Terry is basically taking the stance of Denzel Washington is, I'm leaving here with something. But like, I thought the thing that you're going to try to leave with is a draft pick and or future cap space. And it doesn't feel like that's the goal of the Falcons, because, their hardline stance means that Kirk, the odds are increased that Kirk is still going to be here on this roster come this season. And the only thing that you are potentially leaving with, the only thing that you're getting out of that is, Kirk's ability to maybe win some football games in the event that Michael Penix goes down with an injury. And so this is truly Terry, he said what he said. So I get it. I just didn't believe it. And now I guess now 3 months later, I'm starting to believe it, that they truly do value Kirk Cousins more as a backup quarterback than a late round draft pick or the potential cap space that they would gain by trading him, which again, I get, but I think it's kind of dumb. So it's like this idea of like the Falcons are like, well, we paid $100 million to get 10 wins out of Kirk Cousins. We got 7 of them last year, so we need to get the other 3 out of him this year. And so we got to keep him until we get those 3 wins, which again, I don't agree with, but I know other people may have differing opinions on that. So, the other thing that we'll say is the Falcons don't have an incentive to come off their hardline stance until after the draft, just because of the expectation that Kirk wasn't going to waive his no trade clause until after the draft. And so we'll see if there's a little bit more give in the Falcons hardline stance, after this weekend. And so the hope is that some of these teams, whether it's Pittsburgh or somebody else, their quarterback plans fall apart this weekend at the draft. And they become a little bit more willing to negotiate in good faith, if you want to call it that, for the Falcons to negotiate that price. And maybe the Falcons can come down on that price, and we'll meet in the middle somewhere, 15 million, right? Instead. So as I've said before, I expect the other teams to call the Falcons bluff on this, right? The consistent narrative has been, we're interested in Kirk Cousins, but only if he's cheap. We're not going to meet the Falcons price, but hopefully this time next week when we get our Kirk Cousins update over the weekend, because they happen only on weekends or Monday mornings, hopefully we'll be having some good news to share on that Kirk Cousins front. So that's what we can look forward to next week. But tomorrow, look forward to more Locked On Falcons content. Continue to make us your first listen by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, as well as the Locked On NFL Mock Draft. That one of the players that we discussed on today's episode, I selected for the Locked On NFL Mock Draft, where all the various Locked On hosts are, and you can go check that out on the Locked On NFL Draft YouTube channel. And so, go check it out to see who I'm talking about. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So while I was recording today's episode, the Falcons announced that they signed a backup quarterback in Easton Stick, who was the player that the Chargers didn't want to be Justin Herbert's backup quarterbacks, and that's why they traded for Taylor Heinicke last year. So, the Falcons will start their offseason activities on Tuesday. So they have a quarterback that will at least be there, because we don't expect Kirk Cousins to be there. So, use this to fuel the Kirk Cousins trade speculation. I just think the Falcons wanted to have a third arm in the offseason camp. It just feels like we're heading to a path where the Falcons bring back Taylor Heinicke at the end of August to be the QB2 behind Michael Penix, if they are successfully able to move Kirk between now and then. But we will see on that front, guys. So there you guys have it. Easton Stick, my guy, national champion from North Dakota State. Yeah, let's do it.